The word hit Emma Crawford like a slap across the face, and she did not flinch. Leave. Theodore Bishop stood in the doorway of his ranch house, 6'2" of weathered granite, his jaw set so hard she could see the muscle twitching beneath his sun-darkened skin. His eyes were the color of the Kansas sky just before a storm, that particular shade of gray-blue that promised nothing gentle. He held a lantern in one hand and a rifle in the other, and the lantern light threw sharp shadows across the hollows of his cheeks, making him look like something carved from the same unyielding limestone that jutted out of the creek beds on his property. Emma did not leave. She stood on his porch in the October dark, her single carpetbag sitting in the dirt beside the bottom step, her boots cracked at the seams from 2 weeks of walking roads that barely deserved the name. She had 47 cents in her coat pocket. She had a letter of character from Reverend Halsey of Abilene that she suspected would not impress this man in the least. And she had a secret so heavy it had been pressing on her sternum for the better part of 6 months, a secret that had driven her out of Abilene, past the edge of everything she had ever known, and all the way to the edge of Theodore Bishop's porch. "I heard you," she said. "I am asking you to reconsider." "There is nothing to reconsider. You haven't heard my proposal yet." "I don't need to hear your proposal. I don't hire women, not since," he stopped. Something moved across his face, something dangerous and old. "Not anymore." From somewhere behind him, deep in the house, came the sound of a child crying. Not an infant, something older. A child who had learned that crying did not always summon help and was doing it anyway because the grief was too large to keep inside a small body. The sound went through Emma like a needle. She had heard that kind of crying before. She had made that kind of crying before, once in a different life, in a house she had burned down in her mind so completely she sometimes forgot it had been real. "Mr. Bishop," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect, "I am not asking for charity. I am asking for 1 week of work. 7 days. Whatever you need done. I can cook, I can mend, I can manage a household, I can teach letters and numbers to children who need them. At the end of 7 days, if you want me gone, I will go. No argument, no scene." He stared at her. The lantern flame guttered in the October wind. "And if I say no," Emma picked up her carpetbag from the dirt. She set it on the bottom step with great deliberateness. Then she looked up at him with the full weight of everything she was carrying behind her eyes, all the betrayal and the dark past and the forced choice that had brought her here, and she said, "Then I sleep on your porch tonight because I have nowhere else to go, and I will ask you again in the morning." The crying inside the house had grown louder. A second voice joined it, younger, more frantic. Theodore Bishop's hand tightened on the lantern, and something in his expression cracked, just barely, just enough for her to see the exhaustion underneath. The pure, grinding exhaustion of a man who had been holding everything together so long he had forgotten what it felt like to put something down. He stepped back from the door. "1 week," he said. "Not a day more." Emma Crawford walked into the house that would, though neither of them could have imagined it then, become her home. She had arrived at the edge of his property in the late afternoon of October the 15th, 1878, which meant she had been on the road since the 4th of the month, when she had slipped out of the boarding house in Abilene, Kansas, before sunrise, leaving $3 on the table for Mrs. Garrity to cover what she owed, and walking west along the Smoky Hill Trail until her feet had begun to blister. And she'd had to beg a ride from a freighter named Holly's who smelled of mule sweat and tobacco, and who, to his credit, had not asked her a single inappropriate question during the 2 days he had let her ride in the back of his wagon among the flour sacks. She had not intended to end up at the Bishop Ranch. She had not intended much of anything, beyond getting herself far enough from Abilene that the man she was running from could not easily find her. His name was Gerald Wick. He was 51 years old, broad-shouldered, silver-tongued, and the kind of man who owned property and people with equal ease and saw very little difference between the two. He had been her employer for 2 years, the owner of the Wick Commercial Hotel where Emma had worked as a bookkeeper, keeping his accounts in a pair of ledgers with red cloth covers that she had since come to understand were the most accurate record of his crimes in existence. She had seen things in those ledgers that she was not supposed to see, numbers that did not add up unless you understood they were adding up to something illegal, payments to men whose names she recognized from the county sheriff's office, debts recorded against people who had never agreed to those debts, a pattern of ownership so deliberate and so cold it had taken her 3 months to fully understand what she was looking at, and one bad night in October when Gerald Wick had come into the office without knocking and seen her reading the wrong pages. She had run 3 days later. She had taken nothing from the ledgers, because taking them would have been theft, and Emma Crawford was not a thief. But she carried every number, every name, every date in her head with the same photographic precision that had made her an exceptional bookkeeper, which meant that what she carried in her head was exactly the kind of testimony that could put Gerald Wick in a federal prison, which also meant that Gerald Wick had a very good reason to find her before she decided to use it. She had not known any of this about herself, this capacity to be the kind of woman men hunted, when she had arrived at Abilene 2 years earlier from her hometown of Lawrence, Kansas, where she had grown up the eldest of 5 children in a schoolteacher's house, and learned early that intelligence was not always a comfortable thing to be born with, particularly in a woman, in 1876, in the state of Kansas. But she was getting ahead of herself. She was always getting ahead of herself. It was a habit she was working on. The inside of Theodore Bishop's house was a revelation of a particular kind of disaster, not filth, exactly. The man was clearly not careless about the fundamentals. The floors had been swept, the hearth had been cleaned, the iron cookstove in the kitchen gleamed with the dull shine of something regularly blacked. But the house had the particular quality of a place that had been maintained by someone who understood necessity and nothing else. The curtains hung crooked. The table had one short leg propped up with a folded piece of leather. The children's boots were lined up by the back door, but 2 of them were on the wrong feet, which meant either the children had put them there themselves or someone had been too tired to notice. A pile of mending sat on the chair nearest the stove, and it had clearly been sitting there for weeks, because the shirts on the bottom of the pile had begun to smell faintly of the smoke from the stove. The children were in the room, which was not what Emma had expected when she'd heard crying, because crying in her experience usually meant bedroom, hiding, privacy. These children were standing in the middle of the kitchen floor in their nightshirts, side by side, holding hands, watching her with enormous eyes. The older one was a girl of about 7, with dark hair as straight and severe as her father's and the same storm-colored eyes. She had stopped crying. She was watching Emma with an expression that was not quite hope and not quite suspicion, but something that lived exactly between the two, the expression of someone who has been disappointed enough times to have developed a careful relationship with wanting things. The younger one was a boy, perhaps 4 years old, with a rounder face and hair that curled at the temples and had clearly not been cut in some time. He had not stopped crying, but he had reduced it to a manageable sniffling, his chest still heaving with the aftermath of grief. He was looking at Emma with the absolute uncomplicated openness of a very small child who has not yet learned to be ashamed of needing comfort. "This is Clara," Theodore Bishop said from behind Emma. His voice had changed slightly, still guarded but with an edge of something softer underneath, the way a man sounds when he is talking about the one thing in the world he has not entirely armored himself against. "And this is Samuel. They should be in bed." "We woke up," Clara said. "There was a light on the porch." "I saw your lantern," Samuel said to Emma directly, with the devastating honesty of a 4-year-old. "Are you an angel?" Emma's throat did something complicated. She set down her carpetbag very carefully and crouched to the children's level, which put her at eye contact with Samuel and slightly below Clara's eyeline, which she did deliberately, because children who had learned to be careful about wanting things generally responded better to someone who did not loom. "I am not an angel," she said. "My name is Emma. I am going to be helping your father for a little while." "Helping how?" Clara asked. "That depends on what needs helping." Clara looked at the pile of mending. Then she looked at Emma. Then she looked at the pile of mending again, with the exhausted resignation of someone who had been looking at that pile for a very long time. "Everything," Clara said. Emma laughed before she could stop herself. It came out real, which surprised her because she had not laughed anything real in 6 months. Theodore Bishop, standing behind her, made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was perhaps the distant cousin of one. "Come on," he said to the children. "Back to bed." He took them, one under each arm, carried them down the narrow hallway to a room whose door he left slightly open, the way parents do when they want the child to feel safe and also want to be able to hear them in the night. Emma stayed in the kitchen and looked around at the disaster of it, the organized, determined, manful disaster of it, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not the sharp, dangerous feeling of attraction, not yet. Something quieter, something that felt very much like recognition. She found the apron on the peg by the door. She put it on. She found the lamp on the shelf. She lit it. And she began quietly to learn the shape of Theodore Bishop's needs by the evidence they had left in his kitchen. He came back 20 minutes later to find her at the stove with a pot of something on the heat, and he stopped in the doorway with an expression she couldn't fully read. "I found the last of the salt pork," she said, not turning around, "and some dried beans that had been soaking, which tells me someone started them this afternoon and then forgot them. There's enough for a bowl each, which I suspect you haven't eaten." A pause. "I haven't." "Sit down, Mr. Bishop." Another pause, longer. Then the scrape of a chair. She put the bowl in front of him without ceremony. She poured herself a smaller portion and sat across the table, because she was also hungry, and there was no earthly reason to pretend otherwise. He looked at her across the table with those storm-colored eyes, and she met the look steadily because she had not come all this way to be looked down at. "You're running from something," he said. It was not a question. She took a spoonful of salt pork and beans and thought about how honest to be. "Yes," she said. "Does it follow people?" She thought about Gerald Wick. She thought about the names in the ledger, the men with badges. "It might. I have children in this house." "I know. I am not intending to bring danger to your door, Mr. Bishop. But I will tell you plainly, if I can stay here quietly and work honestly, I am far less likely to become a problem than if I go wandering the countryside alone. A woman alone on these roads is a problem looking for somewhere to happen. A woman with work and a roof is just a woman with work and a roof." He ate. She ate. The fire in the stove popped and breathed. "What did you do?" he asked. "Before. Bookkeeping. Before that, teaching. I can manage accounts, correspondence, household organization, instruction for children through basic arithmetic and reading comprehension. I can also cook adequately, though not brilliantly. I can mend well. I can manage a garden if there is one. I am not afraid of hard work, and I do not complain. Every woman who's ever worked for a man has said that. And some of them meant it." He almost smiled. She saw it, the beginning of it, moving across the corner of his mouth before he suppressed it with what she suspected was considerable practice. He had the face of a man who had been beautiful once, and had let weather and sorrow have their way with him, not carelessly, but deliberately, as if beauty had seemed beside the point after a certain kind of loss. The loss was there in everything, in the mending pile, in the child's boots on the wrong feet, in the way he had come to the door with a rifle as his first response to an unknown woman on his porch. "My wife died," he said, not gently, not as a confession, as information delivered straight. "I am sorry," Emma said, and she meant it without performance. 18 months ago, fever. It took her in 4 days. He picked up his spoon again. "Clara tries to manage. She's 7 years old and she tries to manage, and I let her because I don't know what else to do. That's not right. I know it's not right. But the hands can't." He stopped, started again. "I can't ask the hands to do women's work. I've tried hiring. The last woman I hired from Hayes City lasted 2 weeks before she decided she'd rather marry a telegraph operator and move to Dodge City. The one before that stole $11 from the household money and left before I noticed. Hence the lack of enthusiasm for hiring women. Hence, he looked at her directly. Why 1 week? Why not longer? Emma chose her words. Because I didn't want to ask for too much. A week seemed honest. It seemed like something you might say yes to. And if the week goes well, she held his gaze, then I might ask for another. He nodded slowly. He finished his bowl. He took it to the basin, which was not something she had expected from a man of his type and era, and she noted it carefully in the running inventory she was keeping of Theodore Bishop. There's a room at the back of the house, he said. It was meant to be a sewing room. It's small. There's a cot and a window. It's clean. That's more than I was expecting. I don't know your circumstances, he said, turning from the basin, drying his hands on a towel that was gray from too many washes. I'm not asking you to tell me, but I want you to know that whatever your dark past is, whatever trouble you're carrying, the children don't need to know it. They've had enough trouble. Agreed, Emma said immediately, and with enough conviction that he looked at her a second time, reassessing something. Good night, Miss Crawford. Good night, Mr. Bishop. She lay awake on the cot in the small room at the back of the house for a long time, listening to the sounds of the Kansas night, coyotes a long way off, wind in the grass, the creak of the house settling around her. She thought about Gerald Wick. She thought about how long a week was and how short. She thought about the girl Clara, who was 7 years old and managing, and the boy Samuel, who had thought she might be an angel. She thought that of all the places she might have ended up running to, this one at least made a kind of sense. She was up before dawn. She had learned the kitchen well enough the night before to find the coffee, the cast-iron skillet, the cornmeal. She made coffee strong enough to justify the morning and put a batch of cornbread in the Dutch oven she found hanging on a hook beside the stove. She found 3 eggs from the previous day in a bowl on the shelf, which told her there were chickens, but no one had been collecting regularly, and she added them to a second skillet with a little of the lard. Theodore Bishop came into the kitchen at first light, already dressed and booted, and stopped when he smelled the coffee. He said nothing. He poured himself a cup from the pot. He sat down. He looked at the plate she set in front of him with an expression she was beginning to identify as his version of gratitude, which was a kind of concentrated stillness, as if the feeling were too large and too private to let out in words. The chickens, she said, sitting across from him with her own coffee. How many? 11. Clara's been collecting eggs, but she forgets sometimes. I'll manage the chickens. What else needs daily attention? He looked at her across the steam of his coffee cup. Then slowly, methodically, he began to describe his ranch. 240 acres of tallgrass prairie in Ellsworth County, Kansas. 112 head of cattle. 4 horses, not counting the 2 working mares. A barn, a smokehouse, a root cellar that needed repairs to its door before the hard freeze came. 3 ranch hands, brothers named Callum, Pete, and young Jed Marsh, who bunked in the hands' quarters near the barn. A kitchen garden that had gone largely unattended since late summer. Emma listened, she filed, she made mental notes of priorities. The root cellar first, she said when he had finished. He blinked. The root cellar, it's October. If the door doesn't seal properly, everything you have stored for winter is at risk. That's your food security. Everything else can wait. A pause. He drank his coffee. You know about root cellars. I grew up in Lawrence. My father kept a root cellar. I watched it flood in '63 because the drainage was wrong and we spent February eating salt meat and nothing else. I learned from that. Something shifted in his expression, a kind of recalibration. I'll have Callum look at the door. I can look at the door. Miss Crawford, I am not suggesting I swing a hammer, she said calmly. I am suggesting I look at it and tell you what's wrong so that Callum knows what to fix. There's a difference between doing and knowing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You're going to be difficult, aren't you? Only when it's useful. This time she saw the smile make it all the way out before he caught it, and it was a remarkable thing, that smile, the way it changed his face completely, lit it up from somewhere inside, transforming the weathered granite into something warmer and entirely more dangerous to Emma Crawford's well-intentioned plan to think of this as purely a business arrangement. The children appeared then, Clara leading Samuel by the hand in a way that had clearly become habit, and Emma rose to make their breakfast, and the morning began. She spent the first 3 days of her week learning. That was the only word for it. She learned the Bishop household the way she had once learned Gerald Wick's ledgers, methodically, attentively, with nothing taken for granted. She learned that Clara liked her cornbread without much sweetening, and Samuel needed his cut small, or he tried to put the whole piece in his mouth at once. She learned that Callum Marsh, the eldest of the 3 brothers, was taciturn but fair-minded, and that he watched her with the suspicious approval of a man who respects competence but distrusts women in general. She learned that Pete Marsh was cheerful and not terribly bright and immensely useful for heavy work, and that young Jed Marsh, who was 17 and looked approximately 14, was desperately shy and turned pink whenever she spoke to him directly, which she found amusing and kept to herself. She learned that Theodore Bishop rose before dawn every day and was in the barn by first light, that he came in for the midday meal but ate quickly and said little, and that he spent the hours between supper and the children's bedtime in the front room, not reading, not writing, just sitting with a particular quality of stillness that she recognized, eventually, as grief. Not fresh grief, not the acute kind that shouts, the chronic kind that has settled in and built itself a room. She found herself thinking about that room that he carried. On the 4th day, she fixed the root cellar. Or rather, she found Callum Marsh standing in front of it looking at the sagging door frame with the expression of a man who knows something is wrong but cannot identify specifically what, and she said, "The left hinge has pulled from the rotted wood. The frame needs to be rebuilt, not just the hinge receipt. If you cut a new frame from that oak board I saw in the barn loft, I can show you where the measurements need to go." Callum looked at her with his suspicious approval face for a long moment. "Come show me the board," he said. They worked on it together for the better part of a morning, Emma measuring and directing, Callum and Pete doing the physical construction, young Jed handing things when asked and going very pink whenever Emma praised his work. By noon the door sealed cleanly, and Callum Marsh looked at it and then at Emma and said, with the brevity of a man who allocates words like a scarce resource, "Good." From Callum Marsh, Emma was already learning. This was practically a standing ovation. Theodore Bishop came to inspect the root cellar before supper, running his hand along the new frame the way a man checks a thing he cares about, looking for failure. He found none. He straightened and looked at Emma, who was standing a few feet away with her hands in her apron pockets, not waiting for praise, just waiting. "You knew about the frame," he said. "My father was a practical man." "Where is he now?" "A beat. He died in 1871, lung sickness." "I'm sorry. It was some time ago." They walked back toward the house in the late afternoon light, the Kansas prairie rolling away from them in every direction, the grass gone to gold and copper with the October, the sky so wide and so blue it seemed almost aggressive. Emma had grown up in Kansas, but she had lived in towns, in the compressed intimacy of streets and buildings and neighbors, and the open land still struck her with a physical force she had not entirely got used to. "Do you miss Abilene?" he asked. He said it carefully, not prying, just asking. "I miss the library," she said honestly. "There was a lending library run by a woman named Mrs. Finch who let you borrow 2 books at a time and never charged late fees because she said if you kept a book longer than 2 weeks you clearly needed it more than she did." He was quiet for a moment. "Sarah had books," he said, "Clara's mother. She brought them from Ohio when we came west in '72. There's a trunk of them in the bedroom. Clara reads some of them. She's advanced for her age. I know. She corrected my spelling this morning." He stopped walking. He turned to look at her with an expression that was somewhere between horror and helpless amusement. "She didn't." "She did. I wrote a list for Callum on the slate board in the barn, and I wrote necessary without the second E, and she pointed at it for a full minute until I understood what she wanted." Theodore Bishop laughed. It came out full and real and completely unguarded, and it was the single most devastating thing Emma had heard in a very long time, because it was also clearly unfamiliar to him, a sound that had been out of practice, the way a musical instrument sounds when it has been closed in a case for too long and someone finally lifts the lid. It stopped as quickly as it had come. He caught himself, and she saw the guilt move across his face, the same guilt she had read in the root cellar door and the mending pile and all the ways he had let things go because letting things go was how he was managing, and laughing felt to him like a betrayal of the woman in the trunk of books. Emma said nothing. She let it pass. She walked back to the house and started supper, and she did not talk about it, and she thought about the hidden motive behind his guilt, which was not that he did not want to live, but that he had forgotten, gradually, that living without her was permitted. On the 5th day, Clara asked Emma to teach her long division. They sat at the kitchen table after breakfast with a piece of chalk and the small slate board that Emma had retrieved from the barn and cleaned, and Emma taught long division the way her father had taught her, with patience and a kind of serious respect for the student's intelligence that Clara received with visible, gratified surprise. The girl was extraordinary, Emma thought, not just in the way that proud adults describe ordinary children as extraordinary, but genuinely, observably. She had a mathematical mind that moved in leaps, and she was hungry for it in the way that intelligent children are hungry for instruction when they have been understimulated for too long. Samuel sat between them and drew horses on a separate piece of paper with coal pencil, occasionally contributing to the math lesson with numbers chosen at complete random, which he offered with great confidence and a total disregard for whether they were relevant. 400, Samuel said. That's a very big number, Emma told him seriously. I know, he said, deeply satisfied. Clara, not to be outdone by her younger brother's arithmetic achievements, solved the division problem in her head before Emma had finished writing it out. Emma looked at her answer, looked at Clara, and said, "Where did you learn to do that?" Clara shrugged. "Mama taught me some, before." A silence. Emma said carefully, "She must have been very good at it." "She was good at everything," Clara said. There was no petulance in it, no self-pity, just the flat factual statement of a child who has processed her grief into a kind of catalog. She could bake and sew, and she knew all the flowers by name, and she could play the hymns on the organ at church, and she could add up a whole column of numbers in her head without writing them down. That's a remarkable woman. I know. Clara looked down at the slate. Papa says I'm like her. He doesn't say it much, but when he does it's like. She paused, searching for words with the precision of someone who has thought about this. It's like he's happy and sad at the same time. Is that possible? Yes, Emma said. That's very possible. I think that's actually one of the most common feelings in the world and one of the hardest to put into words. You've done it very well. Clara looked at her with a directness that was startlingly adult. Are you going to stay? She asked. After the week, Emma had not been expecting the question, not yet, not so directly. She was on day 5, 2 days left. She had not let herself think about it in terms of Clara's directness, because thinking about it that way made it feel like a trap, like a forced choice between what was practical and what was beginning to feel, against every ounce of her better judgment necessary. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I think you should, Clara said. Samuel thinks so too. Samuel thinks most things should involve 400 of them. Clara laughed, sharp and sudden, and it was a laugh that sounded exactly like her father's had sounded in the prairie light, real and slightly rusty, and Emma's chest did that complicated thing again. On the 6th day, Emma sent a letter. She wrote it in her small, precise bookkeeper's hand, using paper she found in the desk in Theodore Bishop's front room, which he had given her permission to use. She addressed it to a man named Abel Cross, who had been a federal marshal based out of Topeka, and who she had met briefly 2 years earlier when he had come to Abilene investigating a land dispute that had been, she now understood, part of the same pattern she had seen in Gerald Wick's ledgers. She had not known his significance then. She knew it now. She told Abel Cross what she knew: dates, amounts, names, the pattern. She wrote it carefully, without emotion, with the precision of someone who had been carrying this information for 6 months and was choosing, very deliberately, to put it down. She did not tell Theodore Bishop she had sent the letter, not because she was hiding it from him, but because it was her own action to take and not yet his burden to carry. She was done with the habit of making her business a man's problem to manage. On the evening of the 6th day, Theodore Bishop came to the kitchen while she was finishing the dishes. He did not come for water or a specific purpose. He came and stood in the doorway the way he had the first night, except that the rifle was not in his hand and his expression was not the same. It was complicated now, layered in a way that she found both more difficult and more interesting than the blunt hostility he'd started with. "Clara told me about the long division," he said. "She's impressive." "She is." He was quiet. "She told me she asked if you were staying." "She did." "What did you tell her?" Emma put down the dish towel. She turned around. "I told her I didn't know yet because I don't, not with any honesty." He came into the kitchen then, not all the way, but further than the doorway. He sat down in the chair nearest the stove, the one where the mending pile had been, which Emma had cleared and organized over the past 5 days. He put his elbows on his knees and laced his big, scarred hands together and looked at the floor for a moment. "I'll tell you what I know," he said, "which is that this house has been better in 6 days than it's been in 18 months. The children are—" He stopped, started over. "Clara smiled at supper tonight. She smiled for no reason. She just smiled at something Samuel said and kept eating. I have not seen her do that since before Sarah died." Emma said nothing. "I know you're running from something," he said. "I know there's a dark past involved and a reason you've been careful with your own information. I'm not asking you to tell me what it is, but I am—" He looked up then and his eyes were very direct, the storm color of them gone darker and more complicated in the lamplight. "I am asking you to stay past the week, if you want to. I'm asking you to stay as long as it makes sense to stay." "As an employee," Emma said carefully. A pause. "For now," he said. "Yes." The "for now" was the most honest thing he had said to her since she arrived, and she recognized it as such, because it contained the admission that things might change, that he was opening a door very carefully and very slowly, with full awareness of what might be on the other side of it and a great deal of uncertainty about whether it was safe to look. "All right," Emma said. "I'll stay past the week." He nodded. He stood. He was halfway to the door of the kitchen when he turned back and said, in a voice that was very quiet, "She would have liked you, I think, Sarah. She liked capable women. She thought there weren't enough of them." Emma let the silence carry that for a moment. "She sounds like she was right about a great many things," she said. He went to bed. Emma stood in the kitchen long enough to let her own feelings settle back into their appropriate places, which took longer than she would have preferred. And then she went to the small room at the back of the house and lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling and told herself very firmly that she was staying because it was the safest option, because the work was honest, because the children needed someone, and for absolutely no other reason whatsoever. She almost believed it. November came in on a cold wind that stripped the last of the cottonwood leaves and sent them skittering across the prairie in great brown sweeps. The work of the ranch changed with the season, the rhythms shifting from the last of the harvest preparation to the harder, denser business of winter readying. Emma learned those rhythms too. She had by now been formally engaged by Theodore Bishop as his household manager, at a wage of $12 a month, which was honest and fair, and which she accepted with equal honesty. She slept in the small room. She ate with the family. She taught Clara and Samuel every morning at the kitchen table for 2 hours, and she had begun to understand that Samuel, for all his randomness and his 400s, had a memory that was startling in its precision. He could repeat back, verbatim, anything he heard, which was a gift of a particular kind that would require careful cultivation. She wrote to Abel Cross a second time in November, adding information she had remembered, cross-referenced details she was increasingly certain about. She received a letter back in mid-November that told her, in the careful language of a federal officer, that her information was being taken seriously, that an investigation was underway, and that she should not return to Abilene until she heard from him again. This she found both reassuring and alarming, because it confirmed what she had feared, that Gerald Wick was being watched, which meant he was also aware that something was happening, which meant his interest in finding Emma Crawford had not diminished. She did not tell Theodore Bishop about the letter from Abel Cross, but she did tell him, one evening when they were sitting in the front room after the children were in bed, he in the large chair by the fire and she on the settee with her mending, that the situation she had come from was more formal than she had initially indicated. He listened to the outline of it without interrupting. She told him about the ledgers, about Gerald Wick, about what she had seen and what she knew, and what she had reported to the marshal in Topeka. She did not tell him everything, but she told him enough that his face changed from careful attention to something harder and more alert. "He's the kind of man who sends people to solve his problems," Theodore said when she had finished. "Yes, I believe so. How long before the investigation concludes? I don't know. Marshal Cross seemed confident but vague, which I take to mean he has enough to work with but not enough to move yet." Theodore was quiet. The fire popped. Outside, the November wind ran along the eaves with a sound like water. "I want you to know," he said, "that you are not required to keep this from the hands. Callum especially. If something comes onto this property that shouldn't be here, Callum is the person you want knowing about it." This surprised her. "You'd tell your hired hand about my trouble." "Callum Marsh has been with me for 6 years. He helped me bring Sarah home from the doctor in Hays City when she was dying. He sat up all night with the cattle during the blizzard of '76 and lost 3 fingers on his left hand to the cold. He is not my hired hand. He is the closest thing I have to a brother." Emma sat with this. The intimacy of it, the way Theodore Bishop had offered her information about his own deepest trusts in exchange for the information she had given him. It was not a small thing. "All right," she said. "We can tell Callum." They told Callum the next morning, the 3 of them standing in the cold of the barn doorway with their breath making small clouds. Callum listened with his habitual economy of expression, and when they had finished, he looked at Emma with his suspicious approval face and said, "So if a stranger comes asking questions, we haven't seen you. Only if it comes to that." "It'll come to that," Callum said with certainty. "Men like what you're describing always send someone." He looked at Theodore. "I'll tell Pete and Jed to watch the road." Theodore nodded. Then he looked at Emma, and for a moment the morning light was full on his face, and she saw something there she had been seeing more and more in the past weeks, a particular way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, careful and wondering, the way a man looks at something he cannot quite categorize and is not sure yet whether to be troubled or grateful for it. December arrived, and with it something Emma had not anticipated, which was Christmas. She had not been thinking about Christmas. She had been thinking about survival, which is what you think about when you are running from a man like Gerald Wick. But Clara had been thinking about Christmas with the focused intensity of a 7-year-old who has spent the last 18 months watching the world be smaller and harder than it used to be, and who has identified Christmas as a place where the old world might briefly reassert itself. Clara came to Emma on the 1st of December with a list. It was written in careful pencil on a piece of paper she had clearly torn from one of her mother's books, which made Emma's heart clench, and it contained 8 items, each of which Clara had evidently thought about at length. Gingerbread, greenery for the mantel, a paper chain for the tree if they could find a tree, a candle in the window on Christmas Eve, the hymn "O Holy Night" sung at some point during the day, sugar candy if at all possible, a letter written to her mother to be burned in the fire so the smoke would carry it up to where her mother was. Emma read the list twice. She was very careful not to let Clara see her face while she read it. "This is a very good list," she said. "Can we do all of it?" "We can do all of it." Clara nodded, satisfied, and went back to her lessons with Samuel. And Emma stood in the kitchen holding the list and thinking about the letter to the mother that would be burned. And she was very glad she was alone in the kitchen for that particular moment. She told Theodore about the list that evening. She read it to him item by item, and she watched his face as she read, which went through several different things in quick succession. When she reached the last item, the letter to be burned, he was quiet for a long time. "She asked you to do this," he said finally. "She asked me to help her do it, yes." "She hasn't," he stopped, said, his jaw tried again. "She hasn't talked to me about Sarah, not much, not directly. She knows I'm not," he stopped again. "She knows you're not ready," Emma said gently, "so she is not asking you. She's asking me, because she trusts me to hold it without falling apart, and she loves you enough not to ask you to do something you can't do yet." Theodore Bishop looked at Emma Crawford in the lamplight of his front room in December of 1878, and what moved across his face was not just gratitude. It was something rawer and more urgent than gratitude, something that had been building for weeks in the small daily exchanges of a shared life, in cornbread and root-cellar doors and long division and honest words given without ceremony in the dark. He said, "Emma," just her name, just that. She said, "I know." And then neither of them said anything else, because they were not ready yet either, not quite. But they were both aware, fully and irrevocably aware, that the week she had come asking for had become something else entirely, something neither of them had planned and both of them had needed. They made gingerbread on the 15th of December, all four of them, the kitchen filled with the smell of molasses and cinnamon, and the sound of Samuel narrating his own gingerbread shaping process in vivid and largely inaccurate detail. Callum was persuaded to ride out and find a suitable cedar tree and bring it back lashed to his horse, which he did with an expression of profound dignity and zero sentimentality. Pete Marsh cut greenery from the creek bank for the mantel. Young Jed, who turned out to have a fine voice, agreed to sing "O Holy Night" at Clara's request, going bright red but hitting every note with surprising purity. Emma found sugar candy at the general store in Ellsworth, when Theodore took the wagon in for supplies in the third week of December. She bought it with her own wages and put it in the bottom of her pocket, and when Clara opened the small paper package on Christmas morning and said, "You got it," with the specific amazement of a child who did not actually believe good things would happen but is proven wrong, Emma had to very deliberately look at the ceiling for a moment. The letter to Sarah Bishop was written on Christmas Eve, in the good ink from Theodore's desk, by Clara, with Samuel adding his name in large, uncertain letters at the bottom. Emma helped Clara fold it. Clara carried it to the fireplace in the front room where Theodore was sitting, watching with an expression that Emma could not look at directly, and Clara said very quietly, "Goodbye, Mama. I hope you can hear the fire," and put the letter in the flames. The paper caught and curled and rose, and the smoke went up the chimney into the Kansas night. Theodore stood up. He put his arm around Clara's shoulders. Samuel pressed himself against his father's other side. And Emma stood at the back of the room where she had meant to be invisible, but Theodore looked up over Clara's head and found her in the lamplight, and the look he gave her was the kind of look that cannot be taken back, that changes things permanently in the space of a single moment. In January, Gerald Wick's man found her. He was not subtle about it. He came to Ellsworth on a gray January morning, asking questions at the general store about a woman named Emma Crawford, and Holly's the freighter, who had carried Emma in his wagon, and who had a poor opinion of men who asked questions about lone women in a particular tone of voice, mentioned it to Callum Marsh the same afternoon when Callum came in for flour. Callum came back to the ranch at a pace that told Emma, when she saw the horse coming up the road, that something had happened. "Man in town," Callum said, "asking for you by name." The fear came up cold and sharp, not the wild fear of a woman without resources, but the focused, specific fear of someone who has prepared for this and is now determining what the preparation requires. "What did he look like?" she said. Callum described him. Emma did not recognize the description, which meant Wick had sent someone she had not met, which was to be expected. "Did he say who he was asking for?" Theodore said. He had come out of the barn when he heard the horse. "He told old Hollies he was looking for a woman named Crawford who'd gone missing from her family in Abilene, said her kin were worried." I have no kin in Abilene, Emma said flatly. No, Callum said. That's what Holly's figured because worried kin don't generally look like that particular kind of man. Theodore looked at Emma. His expression was very clear and very calm, the calmness of a man who has made a decision and is not going to be moved from it. Go inside, he said. Theodore, go inside, Emma. Callum and I will handle this. She wanted to argue. She did not argue, because Theodore's calmness was the calmness of someone who knows what they are doing and the argument would cost them time, and she trusted him, which was a thing she had not expected to feel and felt completely. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table with Clara, who was doing her morning lessons, and she read over Clara's arithmetic without seeing any of it, and she waited. The man from Abilene came to the ranch an hour later. Emma heard his horse, heard the voices in the yard, heard Callum's voice in particular, which had a quality to it she had not heard before, very flat and very final, the voice of a man informing someone of facts that are not negotiable. She heard Theodore's voice, which was quieter but had exactly the same quality. She heard the horse leave. Theodore came inside 10 minutes later. He sat down across from her at the kitchen table in the chair that had become, over the course of several weeks, his chair for this specific purpose, the purpose of talking to her honestly. He's gone, Theodore said. What did you tell him? That no woman named Crawford had ever set foot on this property, and that if he came back asking questions that weren't his business we would be having a different kind of conversation. Emma released a breath. He'll report back to Wick. Yes. And Wick will know you didn't just disappear, he'll know you're somewhere in this county. Theodore's jaw tightened. How much longer does the marshal need? I don't know. She looked at him directly. I've been writing to Marshal Cross every week. He says the investigation is progressing. He says, write to him today, Theodore said. Tell him the situation has become urgent. Tell him to move. She wrote to Abel Cross that afternoon. She wrote with a directness that she had been holding back in the interest of professional courtesy, and she told him that Gerald Wick's people had located her, that her safety was now a practical concern rather than a theoretical one, and that she needed the investigation to conclude within the next 30 days or she would be forced to go elsewhere, which she did not want to do, and which she suspected would make his case substantially more difficult. Abel Cross wrote back in 2 weeks. He told her the arrest warrants had been issued. He told her that Gerald Wick had been taken into federal custody in Abilene on the 18th of January, along with 4 members of the county sheriff's office who had been identified as participants in his scheme. He told her that her testimony, submitted in her letters, had been sufficient to establish the primary counts, and that she might be called to testify formally at a later date but was free to consider herself no longer at risk. She read the letter twice. She sat very still for a moment. Then she went to find Theodore. He was in the barn doing something with a piece of harness that he appeared to be mending himself, with a concentration that suggested it was standing in for something else. He looked up when she came in, reading her face immediately, with the particular fluency of a man who has been paying very careful attention to that face for 3 months. It's over, he said. It's over. He's in custody. Theodore set down the harness. He let out a slow breath that was not quite a sigh but had the same quality of release, the sound a man makes when he puts down something he has been carrying on behalf of someone else, in the full knowledge that it was theirs to carry, and he was carrying it because he wanted to. Good, he said. She stood in the barn door with the January cold at her back and she said, because she needed to say it while she still had the bravery of the moment, I don't have a reason to leave anymore. Theodore Bishop stood in the middle of his barn in the winter light and looked at Emma Crawford, and he said, You never had a reason to leave, not from my point of view. Theodore. I know what I'm saying, he said, and his voice was very quiet and very certain. I am not confused about what I mean. This he gestured with one hand, a gesture that encompassed the barn and the house and the prairie and the children inside the house and everything that had grown up over 3 months of honest living. This is what I mean. You are what I mean." Emma crossed the barn floor and stood in front of him, close enough that she had to look up at him, which she did without the slightest embarrassment, and said, "I came here asking for a week." "I know." The corner of his mouth moved. "I've been thinking I owe Clara a debt because she asked you to stay when I was still convinced I didn't need anyone. She also asked you the same week she corrected my spelling. She has opinions," he said. "She gets that from her mother. And from you." He looked at her. His hand came up very slowly and with great deliberateness and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, which was such a small thing and so enormous that Emma had to remind herself to breathe. "Will you stay?" he asked. "Not as my employee. Not as the woman who fixes my root cellar and teaches my daughter long division. Will you stay as—" He stopped. He was not a man who found words easily when they mattered. She had learned that about him. "Yes," she said before he had to find them. He kissed her then. In the cold of the barn in January, with the cattle moving quietly in the stalls around them. A kiss that was careful at first and then not careful at all. The kind of kiss that happens when two people have been honest enough with each other that there is nothing left to be careful about. She had not been kissed in several years. She had forgotten that it could feel like this, like coming in from cold weather, like something returning to its right place after a long absence. February was a different animal entirely from January. The cold came down hard, the blue northers that swept across the Kansas plains with a ferocity that took the breath away, dropping temperatures overnight from bearable to dangerous. Emma, who had grown up in Kansas and remembered the winters, managed the household through the worst of it with a competence that Callum Marsh described in his highest register of praise, as "she knows what she's doing." The children bloomed. This was the only word Emma had for it, the word she used privately for what she was watching in Clara and Samuel through January and February, and into the tentative warmth of March. Bloomed like things that had been dormant, like the prairie itself in the spring, with a suddenness and thoroughness that was almost alarming in its beauty. Clara laughed more often. She laughed easily and without the guilty restraint of the early weeks, the laugh that sounded like her father's. She was working through mathematics at a rate that had Emma writing away to a woman she had known at a school in Topeka who might have suggestions for further materials. Samuel had begun to read. This was Emma's particular joy, because she had begun teaching him letters in November, gently, without pressure, letting him go at his own pace. And by February he had made the connection between the letters and the sounds and between the sounds and the words. And one morning in March, he read the first sentence of a primer Clara had outgrown, aloud, in full, without help, and then looked up at Emma with an expression of complete amazement, as if the world had just become immeasurably larger. "I did it," he said. "You did it," Emma confirmed. 400 words, Samuel said confidently. "Well, one sentence today, but yes, eventually." Clara, who was sitting across the table, said to her brother with the solemn pride of an older sibling, "Wait until you can read a whole book." And the look on her face was so entirely her father's face, the pride that came out as quiet understatement, that Emma had to go and attend to something at the stove for a moment. Theodore asked her to marry him in April. He did it properly, which meant he thought about it for a long time beforehand and chose a moment that was not grand, because he was not a grand gesture man, but that was private and right. He chose the kitchen, in the evening after the children were in bed, which was where they had had most of their honest conversations, and he sat across the table from her the way he always did, and he said, with the directness that was his particular form of eloquence, "I want you to be my wife. I want you to be Clara and Samuel's mother in law and in fact, and in the way they already think of you. I want to spend the rest of my life with someone who knows what a root cellar frame looks like, and corrects my daughter's spelling and writes letters to federal marshals with the calm efficiency of a woman who has fully decided to handle her own problems. I want it to be you." Emma put down the mending she was holding. She looked at Theodore Bishop across the kitchen table, at his weather-darkened face and his storm-colored eyes and the slight unevenness of the smile he was holding very carefully in case she needed him to take it back. And she felt the fullness of it, the fullness of what had happened in this house since October, the specific, irreversible fullness of a life that had found its right shape. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He stood up. She stood up. He came around the table and took her hands and held them, just held them for a moment, because he was the kind of man for whom holding someone's hands was not a small thing. And then he kissed her again, which was every bit as right as the first time in the barn had been. They were married in May, in the small church in Ellsworth, by Reverend McDougall, who was not Reverend Halsey of Abilene but who had known Theodore for 6 years, and appeared to view the occasion with enormous personal satisfaction. Callum Marsh stood up as Theodore's witness. The Marsh brothers as a whole were present in the front row, Callum with his precise dignity, Pete with his enormous cheerful grin, young Jed going pink as a peony and clutching his hat brim. Clara was the one who insisted on carrying flowers, wild flowers she had gathered from the creek bank herself at 6 in the morning, prairie roses and blue spiderwort, and the last of the wild indigo, arranged with surprising artistry in a bunch tied with a piece of blue ribbon she had been saving in her mother's jewelry box. She walked very straight and very seriously to hand them to Emma at the beginning of the ceremony, and when she put them in Emma's hands, she said, quietly and for Emma's ears only, "Mama would have liked this. I really think she would have." Emma held the flowers with both hands and she said, "I think so too." Samuel's contribution to the wedding was to wear his good shirt without complaint for the full duration of the ceremony, which he later reported to Callum was approximately 400 minutes long, and which Callum confirmed was, all things considered, correct. The summer of 1879 was a good one for the Bishop Ranch. The cattle were healthy and the grass was high, and Callum had found a reliable buyer in Wichita who paid fair prices and did not try to run the kind of games that some of the cattle buyers out of Dodge City played. Theodore rode to Wichita in July with Callum and Pete and 2 of the beef herd, and while he was gone, Emma managed the ranch with a composure that Jed Marsh found either deeply impressive or deeply terrifying, depending on his mood. She also discovered she was expecting. She knew before she told Theodore. She knew for 2 weeks before she told him, carrying the knowledge the way she had learned to carry important things, with care and deliberateness, making sure she understood it herself before she gave it to someone else. She told him on a Tuesday evening in August, sitting on the porch at the end of the day's heat, watching the sun go down behind the prairie horizon in a long wash of orange and gold. He said nothing for a moment that lasted long enough that she began to wonder whether she had misjudged the timing. Then he said, "A baby," in a voice that was so stripped of its usual careful control that it was almost unrecognizable. "In the spring, I think, March or April." He turned and looked at her on the porch bench beside him, and she saw everything in his face at once, the joy and the terror and the old grief of watching the last birth, because Sarah had died only 18 months after Samuel was born, not in childbirth but not far removed from it in the sequence of things, and the fear was real and legitimate, and she was not going to pretend it was not there. "I am healthy," she said. "I am not fragile. Women have babies and live to tell about it constantly, and I intend to be one of them." He took her hand. He held it very tightly. "I know," he said. "I know. Theodore, I know you're afraid. I am not going to tell you not to be. But I need you to be afraid and hopeful at the same time, the way Clara said, happy and sad at the same time, because I am, and it will be easier if we do it together." He raised her hand and kissed her knuckles, the back of her hand, her wrist, with a gentleness so complete and so earnest that it put an ache in her throat. "Together," he said. "Yes." They told the children at supper. Clara received the information with the specific gravity of a 7-year-old, who is being entrusted with something serious and knows it. She asked a series of practical and frankly impressive questions about timing, the sleeping arrangement's implications, and whether the new baby would also need to learn long division, which Emma assured her was inevitable. Samuel asked if the baby would be 400 years old. This broke Theodore's careful composure entirely, and he laughed until he had to put his fork down. And Jed Marsh, who had been eating with the family that evening because Callum and Pete were in Ellsworth, went very red and grinned into his plate and said nothing, but was clearly delighted by all of it. Fall came around again, the first anniversary of Emma's arrival, and she stood on the porch on an October evening and thought about the woman who had come to this door with a carpetbag and 47 cents and a terrible secret, and asked for 1 week. She was wearing Theodore's jacket over her own because the October air had an edge to it, and she was 5 months along and felt the cold more than usual. From inside the house she could hear Clara reading aloud to Samuel from one of her mother's books, the patient rhythmic sound of a girl who had decided her brother was going to love books whether he participated in that decision or not. From the direction of the barn, she could hear Theodore and Callum discussing something in the low, unhurried tones of men who have been working together long enough to have developed a shared language of practicality. The prairie spread away from the porch in every direction, enormous and gold in the October light, and Emma Crawford Bishop stood in the middle of it and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the absolute specific peace of a person who is exactly where they are supposed to be. Theodore came up from the barn 20 minutes later and found her still on the porch. "You'll get cold," he said. "You'll notice I have your jacket." He came up the steps and stood behind her and wrapped both arms around her, which he had developed the habit of doing when she was standing somewhere looking at something, and rested his chin on the top of her head, which she found both ridiculous and perfect. "1 year," he said. "You counted." "I counted." He paused. "Do you know what I thought when you were standing on this porch asking for a week? That I was going to be trouble. That you were going to be trouble," he confirmed. "I was not wrong." "You were not wrong. I was also," he stopped, started again. "I was also, underneath all of that, the thing I did not understand yet, which was that I was relieved. That something had come to the door that was alive in a way this house had not been for a long time." Emma turned in his arms and looked at him in the October evening light, this man she had not been looking for and had found, this good and serious and gradually, thoroughly opening man. And she thought that the word she would use if asked to describe the whole of it was not lucky, though it was that, and not grateful, though it was also that. The word she would use was home. "Go tell your daughter to put the book away," she said. "It's nearly supper time." He kissed her forehead. He went inside. Emma stayed on the porch for 1 more minute, watching the sun finish its descent below the Kansas horizon, and then she followed him in. March arrived on a cold and then a warm and then a cold day in 1880, the Kansas weather making its usual declarations of independence from any expectation, and Emma's son was born on the 17th of the month, a Thursday, delivered by the midwife Mrs. Hagen from Ellsworth, who was German and efficient and had delivered approximately half the children in Ellsworth County, and did not tolerate what she called unnecessary performance in her delivery room. The labor was long and hard, and Emma did not hide from Theodore that it was hard, because she had told him they would do the fear together and she meant it. But she was also, as she had promised, not fragile, and when it was done and Mrs. Hagen put the baby into her arms and said, with German precision, "A boy, 8 pounds, good lungs," Emma looked at the red, furious, enormously opinionated face of her son and felt something she could only describe as an absolute completeness. Theodore was allowed in after Mrs. Hagen had declared all relevant parties satisfactory, and he sat on the edge of the bed and took Emma's free hand and looked at his son with an expression that Emma memorized, because it was the exact expression she had seen flashing at the corners of his face throughout their year together, now fully permitted, fully out, the face of a man who has allowed himself to be wholly, irreversibly glad. "What will we name him?" Emma asked. Theodore was quiet for a moment. "James," he said. "My father's name." "James," Emma agreed. "James William," Theodore said. "If you agree, I agree." Clara and Samuel were permitted entry to meet their brother in the afternoon, having been maintained in a state of barely manageable anticipation by Jed Marsh, who had drawn the family management duty while Callum and Pete were seeing to the cattle, and who had survived the experience with his youth if not his nerves fully intact. Clara came in first, with Samuel behind her, and she approached the baby in Emma's arms with the solemnity of someone performing a very important inspection. She looked at James William Bishop for a long time. "He's red," she said. "Babies are often red," Emma said. "He looks angry. He has opinions already. He's going to fit right in." Clara looked at her father. Something passed between them, some communication in the shared language of people who have grieved the same loss and come out the other side of it into something unexpected and good. Then Clara looked back at the baby and said, with the authority of someone who has decided, "I'm going to teach him long division when he's ready." "He'll be lucky to have you," Emma said. Samuel, who had been waiting his turn with an effort that was visible in every line of his small body, pressed forward and looked at his brother and said, with complete confidence, "He'll be 400 years old someday." Everyone laughed, even the baby, though that might have been a coincidence. The summer of 1880 was the summer Emma wrote her formal statement for the federal trial of Gerald Wick. She wrote it at the kitchen table, in the same small, precise hand she had always used for accounts, and Theodore sat across from her while she wrote it, not helping, not interfering, simply there, the way he was always there, with a solidity that she had come to understand was his specific form of love, the gift of a presence that did not waver. Gerald Wick was convicted in September of 1880 on 4 counts of fraud and 1 of conspiracy with officers of the law. He was sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary. The news came in a letter from Abel Cross, who wrote in his careful official language that the testimony of Emma Crawford Bishop had been determinative in establishing the pattern of fraud, and that the court was in her debt. Emma folded the letter and put it in the desk drawer where she kept things that mattered, and she did not think about Gerald Wick again for a very long time, because she had other things to think about. James was a confident and noisy baby who had strong preferences about everything and communicated them clearly from the beginning. He wanted to be upright and observant. He wanted to be held facing outward so he could see what was happening. He wanted to be part of things. Clara called this being opinionated. Theodore called this being like his mother, and Emma found this an irresistible compliment however she turned it. By the time James was 8 months old and pulling himself upright against every piece of furniture in the house, Emma had begun to understand that the Bishop household had not reached its final shape. She felt this as a certainty, not a wish, a settled knowledge of the kind she had learned to trust. She was right, as it turned out. Autumn of 1881 brought 2 developments of note. The first was that Jed Marsh, who had grown 6 inches since Emma's arrival, and was now 19 and no longer perpetually pink in his social interactions, had fallen into a courtship with the youngest daughter of the family who ran the mill at Ellsworth, a sturdy and cheerful young woman named Alice Porter, who apparently found young Jed Marsh's combination of earnestness and fine singing voice entirely compelling. Callum reported this development to Emma with his customary economy. "Jed's courting the Porter girl. Seems serious." Emma received this as the excellent news it was. The second development was that Emma was expecting again. She told Theodore in the same way, on the porch in the evening, because it had been the right place the first time. He reacted with less fear this time, and more of the pure unguarded joy she had seen on his face when he looked at James, and he lifted her off the porch and kissed her until she laughed and told him to put her down before someone saw them, by which she meant the ranch hands who were working near the barn, and he put her down and kept grinning with the helpless completeness of a man who has stopped being afraid of being happy. This second child was born in June of 1882, on a warm morning that smelled of the creek and the new grass, a girl, delivered with the same efficiency by Mrs. Hagen, who noted with satisfaction that this labor was shorter and congratulated Emma on her competence as if it were something she had prepared for rather than endured. The baby girl was born with her mother's dark brown hair and her father's storm-colored eyes, and a disposition so serene that even Clara, who had inspected her with the same rigorous assessment she had applied to James, declared after a long consideration, "She's going to be calm. This one is going to be the calm one." "I hope so," Theodore said, looking at Emma with private hilarity. "We need one." They named her Ruth Sarah, the second name for the woman who had loved books and taught Clara mathematics, and who had been, before any of this, the center of this family and the source of its particular quality of love, which had not diminished but had expanded outward, making room, which is what love does when it is real. Theodore told Emma the name before he told the children, sitting beside her on the bed while Ruth Sarah slept in the cradle that had been used for both Clara and Samuel and James. And when he said Ruth Sarah, he said it with the careful steadiness of a man who has found the right way to do an important thing. Emma took his hand. "She would be glad," she said. "Yes," he said, "I think she would." The years that followed were the shape of a life that had found its right arrangement, which is not to say they were without difficulty or change, because no life is, particularly a life lived on the Kansas plains in the 1880s with cattle and weather and children, and all the ordinary complications of ordinary days. There were hard winters and dry summers, and the persistent small emergencies of a working ranch. There were moments when Theodore's grief resurfaced with a force that surprised them both, and moments when Emma's self-sufficiency became a wall she had to remember to open a door in. There were arguments, short and settled, because they were both direct people who did not have the patience for anything else. There were days when the children were too loud and days when Theodore was too quiet and days when Emma was too much in her own head, running numbers that did not need running. But there were also evenings on the porch in every season, spring light and summer heat and October gold and winter white, the two of them sitting with the quality of people who have arrived somewhere and know it, who have looked at each other with honesty enough times to have burned away every pretense. And what remains, what will always remain, is this. Two people who chose each other after the worst of things had been survived, because they recognized in each other the thing that makes survival worth the trouble, which is not safety or comfort, though those are good, but the specific, irreplaceable sense that you are known and knowing and glad of it. In 1884, on a Thursday morning in late May, Emma Bishop sat at the kitchen table with all four of her children. Clara was 13, finishing the last of the mathematics curriculum Emma had designed for her with the help of the woman from the Topeka school, and composing, in her spare time, letters to a women's academy in Topeka that had opened the previous year for girls of academic promise. She had her mother's eyes and her grandmother's books, and a mind that was going to do things that neither Kansas nor 1884 had quite caught up with yet. And Emma was absolutely certain of this, and told Clara so on a regular basis. Samuel was 9, reading everything he could get his hands on, which in a house with a trunk full of Sarah Bishop's Ohio books and a stepmother who rode away to lending libraries with the focused determination of a woman who believes books are not optional, meant he was reading constantly, voraciously, with the photographic memory that had proven itself over and over, and with a humor that got drier every year and was going to be lethal by the time he was 20. James was 4, opinionated, cheerful, and currently attempting to put an entire piece of cornbread into his mouth in the single bite that Emma had been discouraging since he was old enough to hold food. She removed it, cut it, and returned the pieces to his plate with the calm authority of long practice, and James received this with the philosophical acceptance of someone who has learned that some battles are not worth fighting before breakfast. Ruth Sarah, at 2, was watching all of this with the serenity that Clara had predicted, the stillness of a child who absorbs everything and says little, and is clearly, already, thinking things through at a level that will occasionally be alarming. Theodore came in from the morning barn work and poured his coffee and sat at the table and looked at all of them, this household, this specific arrangement of people that had begun with a woman at the door on a cold October night with a carpetbag and 47 cents. He looked at Emma. She looked at him. This exchange, wordless and complete, was something they had developed over 6 years of marriage, a language of two people who have been honest with each other in the dark often enough that daylight required no translation. "Callum says the south pasture fence needs work," he said. "Callum has been saying that for 2 years," Emma said. "He has. This year I think he means it." "Then fix the fence." "Yes," Theodore said. "That was my plan." Clara, without looking up from her mathematics, said, "Papa, Jed's wife had the baby last night. Alice sent word with the freighter." Theodore looked up sharply. "Boy or girl?" "Boy. They named him Theodore." The table was quiet for a moment, and Theodore Bishop had an expression on his face that was so completely unguarded and so entirely moved that Emma reached across the table and put her hand on his. Right there in the breakfast light, in front of all 4 children, who received this demonstration of parental affection with varying degrees of interest, and one request from James for more cornbread. "That's a fine name," Theodore said, and his voice was even. "It's a very fine name," Emma agreed. He turned his hand under hers and held it, and the morning went on around them, the Kansas light coming through the kitchen windows in its long slanted way, the children making the sounds that children make, the fire in the stove doing what fires do, the world outside the window going about its business of being enormous and indifferent, and from the right vantage point, which was this one, this specific ordinary morning in May of 1884 in a house in Ellsworth County, Kansas. Absolutely full of meaning. Later that evening, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, they sat on the porch. It was warm enough for May, a soft evening, the sky going from blue to deep purple to the particular velvet darkness of the plains at night, where the stars came out in quantities that never entirely stopped being startling no matter how many times you saw them. A coyote called somewhere to the south, a long, lonesome sound, and was answered at a distance. "Do you remember," Emma said, "what you said to me the night I arrived, before you let me in?" "I said leave," Theodore said. "You did. I was wrong to say it." "You were frightened," Emma said, "and tired and carrying everything." "You were not wrong, you were just not yet at the right place." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What would you have done if I hadn't let you in?" "Slept on the porch," Emma said. "I told you I would." "And in the morning?" asked again. She paused. "I was not ready to give up. I had nowhere to go, but beyond that she thought about how to say it. When I stood on that porch in the dark, I could hear Clara crying through the walls. I could hear it, and I thought, that child is 7 years old and she has run out of people to lean on, and I know what that feels like, and I am not going to walk away from it. So no, whatever you said, I was not going to leave." Theodore turned his head and looked at her in the darkness, and she could see him by starlight, the familiar lines of him, the man she knew so well she could read him in any light. "She asked you to stay," he said quietly. "Before I did." "She did," Emma smiled. "She has opinions. She gets that from you now. She always had them. She just had someone to learn to use them from." Theodore was quiet for a long moment. The stars moved infinitesimally in their ancient tracks. The coyote called again, further away now. "Emma," he said, "yes, I want you to know something. Tell me. That first morning, when you made coffee and put a bowl of food in front of me and sat across the table without asking my permission, and without performing any kind of softness you didn't feel," he stopped. Tried again. "I had been surrounded by people being careful with me for 18 months, walking around me like I was going to break. You sat across that table and ate your beans and told me you could fix things and you weren't going to complain. And you looked at me like I was a person who could handle honest company, and he exhaled. That was the moment, not the root cellar or the long division or the Christmas letter. That first morning. That was when I understood that you were going to change everything. whether I was ready for it or not. Emma Crawford Bishop sat on the porch of her house under the Kansas stars and listened to the man she loved tell her the moment he had first loved her, and she felt the full weight of it, not the sharp romantic weight of it, which was real, but the deeper, quieter weight of a story that had been true all along, that had been true from the moment she had picked up her carpetbag and set it on the bottom step and refused to leave. She leaned into his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The night went on in its wide, unhurried way. "I knew too," she said finally. When you laughed on the porch in October. The first time I made you laugh out here about Clara and the spelling. You caught it, you tried to pull it back, and I thought, this man has been in there this whole time, behind all the granite and the guarding. And I thought, whatever trouble I am in, wherever I end up going from here, I want to know how the rest of this laugh sounds. He made a sound that was exactly the laugh she had been describing, low and real and unguarded, and she felt it against her cheek where she rested against him. "You stayed to hear a laugh," he said, "among other things. And now—" Emma tilted her head up and looked at him in the starlight, this good man, this father, this partner, this keeper of honest silences and careful words, who had opened his door on a cold October night for a woman with nowhere to go and let her stay through the first week, and the season after and all the seasons after that. "And now," she said, "I am exactly where I intend to be." He kissed her. The stars turned overhead in their ancient patient way. The ranch lay quiet around them, the barn dark, the horses settled, the children sleeping in their beds inside the house that had become, by degrees and by honesty and by the particular grace of two people who chose each other on purpose, a home. The coyote had gone quiet. The prairie breathed in the darkness, and everything that needed to be was at peace.